My name is Michel Hox. I'm director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And we're delighted to welcome you all to today's event called Beyond the Ballot, dealing with the after effects of the Taiwanese elections and its impact on US-China relations. Let me tell you something about the space that you're in. This is the Washington, D.C. office of the Keough School of Global Affairs, which was founded now almost 3 years ago by the University of Notre Dame as the first new school in a century. Notre Dame likes its traditions, but after about 100 years, they thought it's time to add a new school, and that was the School of Global Affairs. It is a major investment by a major university to weigh in on global issues through a unique brand of ethically driven scholarship. In other words, to find out what on earth we're doing on the earth and what are we going to do with the earth. The Liu Institute, as generously supported by the Liu family, which is a Taiwanese-American family from California, has the role within the School of Global Affairs to try to make sure that Asia, however defined, is always a part of the discussion of global affairs. That is what we do. That is what we bring into our teaching, into our research, and also into our events such as this one. If this is your first time here, we will be back, and we hope to see you back as well. We have a pretty busy program today, so I'm not going to speak for a long time, and I'm not going to make lengthy introductions, but I'm going to say a few words about our keynote speaker today, Randall Shriver, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs. With emphasis on the former. We're very grateful to you for quitting just before we were able to have you here on the podium so that you're free to speak on the issues in which you have such deep expertise. Our leaflet says it in no uncertain terms. Randall Shriver was, and still is, a top expert on Asia policy in this country. An expert on security, an expert on Asian affairs in general. He's worked in many roles in both the State Department and in the Pentagon. He served as an intelligence officer. He's been active in consultancy and research. He just told me he taught at Stanford for 14 years here in Washington as well. My personal favorite, he was responsible for the day-to-day management of the bilateral relationships with the People's Liberation Army and at the same time bilateral security and military relationships with Taiwan. Not an easy job to do, I think, especially not at the same time. On his Wikipedia page, this is all summarized in one sentence. He is a critic of China and a supporter of Taiwan. The world is very simple when you do Wikipedia. I'm pretty sure that in his 20-minute comments and in the Q&A that will follow that, he will have a lot more to add to that. So please welcome Randall Shriver.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here at the Keough School of Global Affairs, affiliate of Notre Dame, and thank you to the Liu Center as well, the Liu Institute, for inviting me and putting on this event. This is one of my first events post-government, and as I said the other day, one of the first times I've put on a tie post-government. And this comes pretty close to Notre Dame colors. I did my best but it's also, I try to be intentional every time I speak about Taiwan domestic politics. I try to do blue and green to represent both sides, because I think it's important as an American. We're agnostic. We don't take sides or have a partisan view on a friend and ally's domestic politics, and we certainly shouldn't in the case of Taiwan. So this was a milestone. It was an important event, and although our friends who are KMT supporters surely feel disappointed with the results, nonetheless, all people of Taiwan should feel proud of the fact that they've carried out successfully another election. The 7th time the president has been voted for, so I think if, to put this in U.S. terms, this would be James Monroe, or I think James Monroe or John Quincy Adams, so if that adds a little perspective. This is still a very young democracy. It's a vibrant democracy and a successful one, but a very young one. So these milestones are important to further solidify the democratic gains that the people of Taiwan have fought so hard to now enjoy. As I said the other day, democracy is not an endpoint. It's not an accomplishment. It's a journey. It's an experiment. And these elections are very key to sustaining that great journey and experiment. As I also said the other day, this is an event that sends important messages throughout the region. There are other elections coming up in the region. I'm told we're going to have one soon in the United States. We all have some vulnerability to the kinds of pressure and coercion, but I think more to the point, the more sophisticated influence operations that China conducts. Taiwan admirably withstood all of that and carried forward with a successful election. I think there are things we can all learn from that and take heart from the fact that Taiwan did this so successfully. And I think also the people of China pay attention to these events. This is Taiwan's election. It's not China's election. But surely there are people in China who wonder why they can't enjoy the same privileges and the same rights that the people of Taiwan, who they are told are the same ethnicity, the same people, but yet they have this right. Why can't they have this right in China? So someday there may be a different China. It would be, I think, largely a result of the inspiration provided by Taiwan and the example of Taiwan if that were to occur. And certainly we hope for that kind of change in China. So let me spend the rest of the time I have talking about some of the implications that I see in this election outcome. Now, that has to be founded on some assumptions of China's reaction and the domestic political environment in Taiwan with the composition of the LY, et cetera. So let me give a little bit of context to what I will later say about U.S. policy, U.S.-China relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations. I think the panel will probably go much deeper into this, but my assumption is China does not largely change trajectory or change their tactics. I think there is a small camp of people who believe Tsai Ing-wen has been reelected, now China's going to have to deal with her. Well, they certainly didn't take that approach in 2004, 2005 when Chen Shui-bian was reelected. They don't show any signs of having a very broad toolkit and being very nuanced and very flexible when it comes to Taiwan historically. So my guess is we continue to see a lot of the same tactics, a lot of the same pressure, stripping of diplomatic allies, military exercises in proximity to Taiwan, and the like. I don't see an appetite for, again, changing the trajectory, sitting down with Tsai Ing-wen. I think that's a mistake. I think Tsai Ing-wen, I know her pretty well. I think she is a pragmatic person. I think she, within the realm of what's possible within the DPP, I think she's done as much as she can to come in their direction and talk about a constitutional environment, talk about ways that there's space for dialogue between the two sides, but Beijing, of course, has not been receptive to that. So my assumption is we continue to see a lot more of the same approaches from China, the more pressure from China. That people are welcome to challenge that assumption, and I look forward to hearing what the panel has to say about it. But to me, that sets the context for what I think are the implications for U.S.-China relations and U.S.-Taiwan relations. Let me start by talking about the bigger picture of the U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific, because China is at the center of that, but Taiwan is at the center of that as well. If you're familiar with our national security strategy, national defense strategy, we talk about the goals of a free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, this is not directed at any one country. This is not an anti-China policy. This is not to say that it can't be inclusive, including cooperation with Beijing. But I think the fact that our strategy is based on certain enduring, near-universal principles that China, at least their actions, suggest they're opposed to, we do find ourselves in competition with China. And we talk very openly about long-term strategic competition with China. So when we talk about a vision for the Indo-Pacific that's based on respect for sovereignty, no matter a country's size, peaceful resolution of disputes, free, fair, reciprocal trade, international law and international norms. Again, that's an inclusive vision, but based on the current policies and decisions that China's making, we do find ourselves in competition, and the competitive aspects of that relationship come more to the fore. Taiwan, on the other hand, is a partner in this effort. And if you read the Indo-Pacific Strategy report that the Department of Defense put out, we very clearly identify Taiwan as a partner in this effort. We do see Taiwan as sharing values and sharing support for those enduring near universal principles. And so we find ways to partner with Taiwan in promoting that and seek ways to build on the cooperation we have to extend our toolkit, our capabilities to support those enduring principles. So with Taiwan as a partner in the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think we need to understand the particular role that we see Taiwan as potentially playing as long as Taipei endorses the same. Well, Taiwan is, of course, on the front lines. They're under extraordinary pressure and face a direct military threat from China. So for the most part, our hope for Taiwan is that they invest in the right things and have a sense of purpose and in a way, a sense of urgency to look after their own defense needs. And we're a partner in that through the implementation, of course, of our Taiwan Relations Act, which says we'll provide weapons of a defensive character for Taiwan's sufficient self-defense. So given that very near real-term threat that Taiwan faces, we look for Taiwan at least to hold the line to preserve their status, preserve their de facto independence, and deal with their immediate challenge so that we are well positioned to deal with the broader challenges in the Indo-Pacific. So we talk about implementation of Taiwan's overall defense concept, something associated very closely with the former Chief of the General Staff, Admiral Lee, who happens to be a fellow at my institute right now. So a little bit of free advertising for Project 2049 here. But he put forward a defense concept that makes a lot of sense for Taiwan. Talk about how to invest in the kind of capabilities that will make Taiwan a hard target should Beijing make that fateful decision to try to deal with the situation militarily. So capabilities that would make Taiwan safe from the amphibious invasion, from the air assault, and so investing in things like coastal missile defense systems, investing in mobile short-range air defense systems. These are things that, in a lot of ways, aren't as expensive as some of the large legacy platforms, but in fact would have very significant military benefit. And Taiwan is moving in this direction. And we are doing things in the administration to try to reorient our security relationship, our military-to-military interactions, to support the overall defense concept and its implementation. So they're on the right track. There is a saying, though, I think it was Mark Twain, somebody can Google me, though, even if you're on the right track, you can get run over if you're not going fast enough. We need Taiwan to have a sense of urgency, make the proper investments, and take care of these defense issues so that there is confidence that there's a deterrent there and that should China ever make that decision, that Taiwan could defend itself. Now, there's a lot of pessimism out there about Taiwan's ability to do so. China is making significant investments in their own defense. But I have to say, 80 nautical miles of water, mountainous, inhospitable terrain, it's a pretty good place to start with defense before you buy a single weapon system. Taiwan is a very, very hard target. And so we think by investing in the right things, they can do an awful lot to complicate the military planning for China and ensure that they continue to survive in their de facto status, and that's what we want to see. We think there are other ways that Taiwan can be a partner in the Indo-Pacific strategy. We talk about it in our own lines of effort in the Trump administration. We used to talk about increasing the lethality of the force, preparedness. We talk about partners and allies, but we'd also talk about promoting a networked region. Promoting a networked region means that, is an acknowledgement of the fact that the security challenges in the Indo-Pacific are increasingly and in many ways inherently multilateral in nature. So anti-submarine warfare, air defense, space, cyber, these are all challenges that are multilateral in nature. And so in order to effectively deal with those challenges, we need multiple countries to participate, bring capabilities to bear, but also to be networked and to be able to share information, share data, share best practices so that all participants can be a part of upholding that order. We believe Taiwan has more to contribute in this area, and again, we're trying to orient our security relationship to support those goals. Let me talk a little bit about what this means for the U.S.-China relationship going forward. And let me say at the outset, the U.S.-China competition is now a global one. We certainly see it throughout the Indo-Pacific in very obvious ways, whether that's in the South China Sea, whether that's into Southeast Asia, where there's competition for influence, into South Asia and Indian Ocean, and even into the Horn of Africa and in Western Hemisphere. It's into the non-geographic sectors, but global spaces such as cyber and space. It's into the Arctic. It's into the Antarctic. Our recent China military power report, which we released in the spring, we had a special section just on the Arctic and what the Chinese are doing in the Arctic. So it is global in nature. But the primary driver for PLA modernization remains Taiwan. The primary source of tension between the United States and China, I would argue, remains Taiwan. And the most likely place where we would have a problem, if not a crisis, I believe, remains Taiwan. It doesn't mean it can't happen somewhere else, but I believe given the focus of China, the inherent contradictions between Taiwan and the PRC, where the United States fits into that, this is still something that is really the focal point of the relationship in a lot of ways. We talk about this. We do maintain contact and engagement with China, even on the defense side. I think there's a perception that our competition with China has diminished the activities on the military-to-military relationship. To some extent they have, but in fact, at the high level, the dialogue has continued at very robust rates. In fact, last year was the first year where we had a Secretary of Defense visit China and a PRC Minister of Defense visit the United States in the same calendar year. Never happened before until last year. This year, one of my last visits was to Beijing, followed shortly thereafter by Secretary Esper meeting with Minister Wei on the margins of the ASEAN Defense Minister meeting plus in Bangkok. So we maintain that engagement, and we talk about the Taiwan issue very much, obviously driven by the PRC's concerns and the fact that it's the major point of concern of our policy in Beijing. But we have interests there too, and so we put those on the table. And our interest is simply that the two sides are in a position to be able to work things out between themselves peacefully and through diplomacy. Our arms sales, in fact, which may be the biggest irritant to the People's Republic of China and to the CCP, our arms sales actually have a very good track record of promoting cross-strait dialogue. My old institute, along with the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council, did a study on the history of U.S. arms sales, and what we found is major U.S. arms sales were normally followed by improvements in cross-strait relations, and in many cases, breakthrough in cross-strait relations. If you look at the 150 F-16s sold in 1992, that was followed 2 or 3 months later by the first cross-strait dialogue, the Guo talks of '92. If you look at, in the Obama administration, 2008, a major arms sales package, $6.4 billion, followed a couple months later by ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. If you look at the Bush administration, largest arms sales package in the history of the relationship to date had been April 2001. That was followed very shortly after by both China and Taiwan entering WTO. So our arms sales and our security assistance to Taiwan is not to promote a political agenda of any party in Taiwan. It is to create that environment that is conducive to cross-strait dialogue and give particularly Taipei the confidence that they can go to the negotiating table without a gun to their head, so to speak, and that they can negotiate from a position of relative strength and be able to come out the other side with outcomes that are mutually agreed to, but also mutually beneficial. So we will continue that, I'm confident. But again, Taiwan will continue to, I think, be a focal point for U.S.-China relations. And it'll start to play out in other interesting ways. Our competition is taking us into the Pacific. We spend a lot of time on the Pacific and Oceania, and that's a place where China-Taiwan competition has historically played out and may start to play out even more given what I expect China's reaction to this election to be. We already saw the change of relations from Solomon Islands. We saw Kiribati make their decision to switch. Taiwan still enjoys diplomatic relations in places like Palau and in the Marshall Islands, but there's a lot of stress and pressure on those countries to make similar type of decision. Now, the United States is engaged in a step-up effort ourselves. We've been heavily engaged in the Pacific. First time ever, we had President Trump host the 3 compact state presidents at the same time, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau. Had him into the Oval Office. We had him in at the Pentagon as well. So the dynamic of trying to help these countries preserve their own sovereignty and look after their own interests, which we feel, again, supports the broader goals of free and open Indo-Pacific, there's probably an important role for Taiwan here to play with its own diplomatic partners, and obviously they have parochial interests in keeping those diplomatic allies on sides, but we also believe in doing so they'll keep partners who are best positioned to help promote the broader interests in the region of promoting a free and open Indo-Pacific. I think the other place that we could see this play out, of course, is the South China Sea. Again, not a U.S. China-Taiwan problem exclusively. There are many other claimant states and there are many other countries with interest there. But given the overlapping claims of the PRC and Taiwan and given some of the previous competition there, we could certainly see that come to the fore in the relationship between the United States and China going forward. We have certainly seen China change some facts on the ground. They've successfully completed some of the land reclamation projects. They've militarized the islands despite Chairman Xi Jinping's pledge in the Rose Garden of the White House that they wouldn't do so. And so some facts on the ground have changed. What we don't want to see change is the quality, the very quality of the waterways there in the South China Sea, and that they remain international, that they remain free and open. And so we're doing what we can on the side of freedom of navigation operations to fly, sail, and operate where the law allows. We're increasingly being joined by other countries to do not only FONOPS, but presence operations, joint drills. We're doing all that, but that has to be sustained, of course, because if you give any area, any space where there's gaps where you're not doing that, China will fill in the void, as they are attempting to do through the militarization of these islands. Taiwan will have a role to play in the protection of its own claims and its own patrols in those areas. So the South China Sea is certainly another area to keep an eye on as we go forward here. So I'm timing myself because having been trained in Washington and having been in policy, I can talk to fill the volume of time allotted. So I'm coming up against 20 minutes here, so I might just pause in a moment and turn to questions and answers. But I do want to conclude again by saying that this election in Taiwan, although agnostic on the party or the outcome, is an important event, not just for the people of Taiwan, but for people here in the United States, on our own journey, on our own experimentation with democracy. It's an important event for people in the region. It's an important event for people in China. So we congratulate not only the victor, but all the people of Taiwan, and we look forward, I can say from the United States perspective, and having just come from the Department of Defense, from DoD's perspective, we look forward to continuing our cooperation with Taiwan, particularly in promoting that free and open vision. So thank you. I'd be happy to take questions, comments, criticism, critiques. The first, this isn't really fair because Chris knows, Chris has forgotten more about Taiwan than I'll probably ever know. So, but go ahead, Chris.
Great to see you. Chris Merritt, 74, Notre Dame, former director of
You hold on one moment, sir, so people can hear you.
2012 to 2015. It's great to see you here, Randy, and congratulations on the next phase. Just wanted, you really gave a good listing of the areas where we might see further pressure from Beijing. I'm sure we will see further pressure from Beijing going forward on Taiwan. One area that I wanted to add to that would be squeezing of international space.
Yeah.
And we've seen Beijing over time conduct a quite successful effort to keep Taiwan out of international organizations where they would otherwise have much to say, much to contribute, as we know, whether it's, there's a whole area, a whole list of places where Taiwan can contribute so much. But I wonder if you could comment on that squeezing of international space and the likelihood that that'll continue going forward.
Yeah, Chris, thanks. It's good to see you as well. And yeah, I think it's a great question. I think we will continue to see it. Remember, even under Ma Ying-jeou, in a much more favorable environment, the international space did not expand greatly. I think they had observership in WHA, World Health Assembly, for a couple of turns. But beyond that, I can't say the record in the Kuomintang era was much better. It's not a criticism of the Kuomintang. That's how China approaches these things. So I think they will continue to put the squeeze on Taiwan, and I think that has a few implications. I know the sort of emotion and passion involved with some of the campaigns to get a seat in the UN or observership in the UN. I see it as extremely unlikely that Taiwan will be able to participate in any meaningful way because China has a veto in those organizations. I think the more fertile ground is probably the non-UN affiliated international organizations where Taiwan has real capability and the member community can really benefit from Taiwan's participation and their resources, their expertise. And so I think there's a category of organizations that fit there. But I think there's also an opportunity to think creatively and create space, create international space. Tsai Ing-wen, having just been reelected, I looked this up the other day, but it's been long enough that I may not get this quite right, but I think there's maybe 19 or 20 democratically elected female leaders in the world. Why not call a meeting? Why not create an international organization and create international space? I think the State Department has a terrific program going with the, and I always forget the acronym, the Global GCTF, where as a partner, the United States is able to co-host things with Taiwan and bring other countries into it. I think that should become expeditionary, not just do those events in Taiwan, but the U.S. and Taiwan go host with a third country in another area. So I guess what I'm saying is the challenge, I think, is going to get more severe, and so the need for creativity and entrepreneurship is even greater.
I think, by the way, that's the Global Cooperation and Training Framework.
GCTF, Global Cooperation and Training. It's a really good initiative, and my only qualm with it is I had nothing to do with it. It happened after I left state and before I got back to DOD, but it's a really great initiative. John.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Did you give
I
me?
apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I moved the mic before you called on.
Sorry. Thank you, Randy. John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Given the stalemate across the Taiwan Strait, given the competition between China and the United States, how high is the possibility of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, not just between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, but also between China and the United States? Thank you.
Well, there's always a risk. I think if we continue to faithfully implement our law, provide Taiwan with what we assess they need and what Taiwan requests, I think there's enough of a deterrent capability there to prevent China from making that decision. In the Department of Defense, we often use the phrase, not today, not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, not next year. We want to buy time, and we want to create enough uncertainty and raise the understanding that the cost would be so great that China decides that they're not going to take military action to try to resolve the disagreement. So again, as I said earlier, I think we're on the right track. I think we need a little more sense of urgency. But there's a risk there. And, among other things we've done, we've increased our Taiwan Strait transits of U.S. naval vessels. Every right to do it. It's international water. And I think we'll continue to do it. But obviously, when you get into that 80 nautical mile waterway, that adds some additional risk in terms of a miscalculation or accident. We take account for that, and we think we still need to do it in order to send the message that that is international water and that we do have interest there, but it does increase risk. So I should mention the relationship we have with the PLA. The primary goal is risk reduction and confidence building. And so we have forums like the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, which I did have a hand in creating in the 90s, where we get operators sitting down with one another and talking about rules of the road and safety protocols and the like, and try to enhance the safety of that environment while we're operating in closer proximity and greater frequency to one another. And so these are efforts that are undertaken in parallel. You know, while we're more active in this area, we also want to make sure it's safe and that there's professionalism on both sides. So Patrick.
Thank you, Juan, for your service to the Republic over many years and for your presentation. I was on the U.S.-China Commission as a commissioner for 10 years. I'm more of an economics and trade guy, but as a young guy, I worked in the State Department on the Law of the Sea Convention. Yeah. I've always thought it would help us to deal with some of the Chinese claims in the South China Sea if we were to ratify that Law of the Sea Convention. Do you agree with that? And secondly, do you think that the Trump administration should make an effort to get the Senate ratification of that agreement?
So I'll speak from a personal point of view, personal perspective. I have long supported ratification of UNCLOS for the United States. Point number two, I'm not sure it enhances our ability to deal with China greatly because China has signed it, ratified it, and doesn't honor it. We've signed it, not ratified it, and honor it. So, you know, taking that extra step, I guess there are some that would see it as having more credibility and being at the table, but in fact, we operate in accordance with the law of the sea and abide by its principles and have for since it was signed, so over 30 years. But I personally support it. Do I think the Trump administration should seek ratification? I think it's so unlikely that this Senate would, in fact, ratify or take it up that I think it would probably be not effort well spent, well used time. I think it is incredibly important to keep pointing out, though, this contrast. China's ratified it and doesn't honor it. We signed it, didn't ratify it, but honor it. Because we have a track record, right? It's not just we say that. We have a very long track record of abiding by it and honoring it and accepting its principles. So I think it's not just an awkward policy position. It's a policy position backed up by a very good track record. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Chair Cheng with United News Group Taiwan. Japan media reported that U.S. government asked TSMC to produce chips for military use in United States. Even if you can't confirm the story, could you tell us if that's necessary for TSMC to do so? Thank you.
Yeah, I have no comment on that. I don't have any knowledge of it. So. Sir.
Yeah, John Mills, thanks, Randy. So the Taiwan Travel Act, so how has that changed things and how has that been leveraged since its enactment?
Well, I think it certainly was a strong expression of congressional support and interest. Somebody will have to remind me what the actual vote was, but it was close to unanimous, wasn't it? Or it's pretty hard to get that in Congress today, right? So pretty strong statement of congressional support. The president signed it, and he was under some pressure not to, so a sign that the administration supports it. So we welcomed it. I think as a practical matter, we had latitude to increase the level of visits and both directions, visits to Taiwan and receive visitors. And we were in the process of doing just that, increasing the level of visits. So I think it became a way to have the reassurance that Congress was going to support it, that we were aligned across parties, but in fact we were in the process of implementing a lot of those activities even before the act was passed. So I think it's a nice to have, a good message to Taiwan and the region and to China, but as a practical matter, we were heading in that direction. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hi, Randy. This is Tina Chong with Voice of America's Chinese branch. My question to you is that General Shen Yiming, do you know him personally? I would guess so,
Yes.
but yeah. Can you talk about the relationship between U.S. and Taiwan, the security part, in the aftermath of the incident of the crash? We saw Chairman of the Joint Chiefs from the U.S. Making a statement. How does that reflect the reality of U.S.-Taiwan security cooperation?
Yeah, I do. I did know him, and I'm probably remiss that I didn't comment on this tragic event. It's anytime you see a friend or partner suffering an incident like that, it affects all of us. Affected people at my institute who had interacted with him. He hosted a dinner for my institute. I was still in government, but a delegation from my institute just a few months before he was tragically killed in that accident. I think the bonds between the United States and Taiwan are very strong and they're very deep. And I think as difficult as it is to move on after something like that, there will be those that come in behind him and will also be supporters of the relationship and will continue to work with whoever those counterparts are. The relationship has the legal foundation, of course, the Taiwan Relations Act, but since the passage of the TRA and it taking effect, through that instrument, we've built incredibly strong ties with Taiwan. So we'll endure beyond this tragedy. Sir.
Hi, I'm Evan Karlik in the U.S. Navy. To what extent does dissolution of the INF Treaty improve U.S. force posture and capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, especially how challenging it is to find partners or allies to be willing to host missiles, and how China would be expected to use economic leverage to punish any country that would host such missiles?
Well, we're at a very early stage at looking at how this newfound latitude for maneuver may be implemented. We were actually honoring the treaty, so we weren't producing these systems. We didn't have a lot, off the shelf ready to go. So it's almost sequential. We have to actually build something, and there's things we could do relatively quickly. But in order to build the right thing, it has to be requirements driven. We have to hear from Indo-Pacific Command and others on what they think their warfighting needs are and how this capability would be integrated into their plans and preparation for various contingencies. So we're in that process of looking at requirements, building the actual systems, thinking through future warfighting and how China may react. And then we'll give some consideration to partners and where we may seek deployment. I think there are those that wanted to put the cart before the horse and get either rush to partners and say, we need you to agree now. The Chinese were rushing to our partners and saying, don't even think about it. But this will be a more deliberate, gradual process. I'm not talking years and years and years, but as Secretary Esper said, months. Months can be 3 months, can be 8 months, it can be 24 months. So I think we're talking, enough time to do this in a thoughtful way. The Chinese will react how they're going to react. The fact is, over 80%, maybe closer to 90% of their ballistic missiles are non-INF compliant if they were a member. They, of course, never were. I would also note that the President, Secretary Pompeo, and others have said the door is open for multilateral arms control. If China is so concerned about us moving in this direction, we'd be happy to talk to them about how these systems could be destabilizing and our concerns with China's deployment, massive deployment of these systems. And by the way, China, if you want somebody to blame, don't look across the Pacific, look north. Because as difficult as it was to deal with China outside INF, I'm very confident, having been in some of those discussions, I'm very confident we would have stayed in were it not for Russia cheating and Russia being outside the agreement. We would have sustained that tension with China to keep the treaty if Russia was in compliance. We gave them every opportunity. They wouldn't come into compliance. So here we are. And I think our warfighters, along with those that do the war planning and those that are involved in the acquisition will do this in a thoughtful way and give us options that we can then talk about in greater specificity with partners and allies when the time comes. Sure. Yes, ma'am. The last one, okay.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed your remarks. My name is Bonnie Gerard, and I head a risk consultancy called China Channel Limited, and I write on China, particularly for The Diplomat, and very proud to be able to do that. I've spent half of my life on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, so I ask this question from that perspective. Is there any sense that, or knowledge, or appreciation for the fact that in China, 71 years on from 1949, we're now into the fourth generation of this divide, and that the fierceness to claim Taiwan is obviously part and parcel of the Communist Party's requirement and program, but not necessarily of the entire Chinese society, and that within Chinese society, everyday people, there is an understanding that this separation may actually be for good. People call jokingly, even official people will say things like, Taiwan is our 51st state, right? They will talk about the difference in cultures having gone on so long that essentially Taiwan is not part of China anymore. Of course, this is in informal meetings, but people, even people in the party, will say things like that. And Taiwan is now such a face-saving issue that it is absolutely necessary from the party's point of view, but there are factions that would like to resolve the problem.
Yeah.
And there may be a wedge that can be used in China to explore that kind of discussion. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I thank you for the question, and obviously your years of living there have given you a great perspective on this, because I have a similar perspective, but mine is mostly anecdotal. The cab driver test or the cafe test, where I've always sensed that the passion is not exactly how the party describes it. I've often been accused of insulting the feelings of 1.4 billion people in China, which I think they mean it as an insult. I always found it quite empowering that I could do that. But yeah, my anecdotal experiences, I think, reveal the same possibility. I think the difficulty is how do you sort of operationalize that at a policy level? The people you deal with are the CCP and the government ministries. I think there are ways to highlight Taiwan not as part of this ongoing unresolved conflict, but Taiwan as a great success story and a point of inspiration and something that China shouldn't fear but should aspire to. I think, exposure is good. I think a lot of people expected when the tourism started, you'd get sort of different outcomes of coming together. I think we haven't seen that. I think it in a way accentuated a lot of the differences and led to a hardening of positions. But maybe over time, that kind of contact and that kind of understanding can grow. So I take the point, and I think I agree with the point. It's just very difficult to operationalize it from a policy perspective because there's such a tight control over Taiwan policy with the CCP and the government. But I think there's something about Taiwan's own story and its inspiration and these, generations later. I think it's true, 47 to 49, the big movement, at the height of that, the ethnic mainlanders only made up 15% of the population at best. And so Taiwan was always a Taiwanized place after the Kuomintang came in. We were talking about this earlier. The interesting thing is in 1980s and early 1990s, many of us could see Taiwanization of Taiwan coming because the Kuomintang had suppressed language, suppressed history, suppressed culture. And so the unleashing of democracy and political liberalization, you could see Taiwanization coming. It's almost impossible to see re-sinification of Taiwan coming. I can't see it. other than through force or coercion, which we're doing things to prevent. So if I can see that and others can see that, maybe there's a chance for a more enlightened approach from China in the future, and maybe that would be partly informed by the voices inside China who see things a little differently than the party. So, thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed for a very enlightening talk, and thank you all for getting the discussion after such a good start. We're now going to move on to our panel discussion, which will involve some movement on the stage, some things being removed, some mics being put on people. It may take maybe 1 minute. I'm not going to read out the bios of the panelists because they're in your program, but just like to call them to the stage, and perhaps you can welcome them. So first and foremost, our moderator, Bethany Ellen Ibrahimian. Yes, please. Currently on his way to the stage, Professor Joshua Eisenman, who's my colleague in the Keough School of Global Affairs. Russell Xiao from the Global Taiwan Institute.
I don't do this very often. 1, 2, 3.
There we go. Thank you. Sean King from Park Strategies and also the Leo Institute and alumni of the University of Notre Dame. And last but certainly not least, Tiffany Ma from Bauer Group Asia. Tiffany.
Sorry, am I in the right seat? Well, I did go down. That's the good thing. It's actually
Well, it's great to be here today. And am I on? Can you hear me? Yes, great. And I was I found Assistant Secretary Shriver's remarks very enlightening and also very thought-provoking for our follow-up discussion right now. Just in terms of how I'm going to lay this out, I'm going to start out with posing some questions to the panelists and to get a discussion going, and then we will open it up for questions to the audience. So I will pose questions, perhaps by suggesting people who can answer, but please, panelists, feel free to jump in at any time, even if I haven't directed the question to you specifically. So I'd like to start out by an overview of the significance of the Taiwan elections that were just held. And Tiffany, if you can get us started, was the result surprising? And what does this election result mean for Taiwan and for cross-strait relations?
Great, thanks, Bethany. So I would actually say, in a way, these results are not surprising given what we've seen in the lead up in the campaigns. So I think very significantly, the elections, we saw two trends. Within Taiwan, there was a competition for the hearts and minds of the voters, and there was kind of a pull between populism that was presented by Han, as well as the idealism and democratic ideals that are advocated by the DPP. And I think the other trend that we've seen is sort of a renewed appreciation, both within Taiwan, obviously, but also internationally, for the importance of Taiwan's democracy, especially as Taiwan sits at the front line of China's authoritarian pressures in the region and attempts to displace the United States leadership in the region. So I think within Taiwan, the pretty significant fact was it kind of bucks the international trend of populism that's been taking over in other parts of the world, in that we did see sort of a triumph of democratic ideals. And I think that's extremely significant for Taiwan, and partly because of Hong Kong. The people of Taiwan saw what was happening in Hong Kong and decided that's not what they wanted for the future. So it was a clear sort of rejection of the one country, two systems model that China offered.
Great. Thank you for that overview. And how do you think, and this is really for anyone, what has been Beijing's reaction to Tsai's victory, and how is Beijing viewing this in terms of the future of cross-strait relations?
Well, okay, allow me to take that then, Bethany. And before I begin, let me just thank the Leo Institute for Asian Asian Studies. As the head of an organization that's exclusively focused on Taiwan, it's always wonderful to see a new player in the field, and I look forward to really the future programs that the Institute will put forward, and look forward to potential future cooperation. If I may just build off actually some of the comments that Tiffany had made earlier with regards to the election results, and then move on to Beijing's reaction. While I think the ultimate results were perhaps to be expected given the many polls that indicated a high level of support for the incumbent president, whether or not those support ratings would ultimately translate to people going out to the polls and voting were never absolutely clear. And I do think that the record number of votes that President Tsai Ing-wen did receive, 8 million votes, which represented about 57% of the votes, was significant and does point to a renewed mandate for her second term. That being said, I think when we dive into other results of the elections, it's worth bearing in mind that it wasn't just a presidential election. There was also a legislative elections held simultaneously. And when we look into the results of that election, the clarity of the results are not as clear-cut as the presidential election, in which, at least in terms of party list votes, the two major political parties, the DPP and the KMT, received almost equal percentage of the party list votes. That's about 33.9% to 33.3%. So I think it's worth bearing in mind in terms of as we are trying to assess what the meanings of the elections, what the public sentiments of the election results may be, to also consider these other nuances to get a better sense in terms of really what the election results mean. And I agree with Tiffany that I think Hong Kong was a large factor because it spotlighted sovereignty as a focal point in the elections, and that played to the incumbent president's strengths, and partially a weakness of the opposition party's candidate with regards to positions on cross-strait relations, where you have one candidate positioning herself as sort of the bulwark against the threat of China's hegemony versus one that looked at promoting a more conciliatory approach. It puts the opposition on a very hard defensive position throughout the election campaign, a sort of untenable sort of position to defend. So with regards to Beijing's reactions, I think is to be expected. I think history has shown that Beijing has been very incapable of adapting and changing its approach. And I think what we can expect to see going forward is, as Randy had mentioned earlier, a hardening of Beijing's, if not a continuation, then a hardening of Beijing's approaches to Taiwan, and that includes this multifaceted pressure campaign that not only involves the utilization of diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, tools of political subversion in the form of political warfare campaigns that utilizes proxy organizations as well as political parties and a host of other measures that we can get into more details if there's interest. But I think we can expect to see more of the same, and this was reflected, I think, in the immediate statements that the Taiwan Affairs Office of the People's Republic of China made to the election results.
Great, thank you for those really insightful comments about what's going on inside of Taiwan. Josh, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, just based on what Russell said. First, I want to reiterate what you said. This is amazing. This is my first New Institute event as well, and so I'm thrilled to be part of what we're doing here. And I hope I'm going to see y'all again soon for our future events. With regard to the question you asked, which I think is the one we're all kind of asking, it's interesting that when we look at China's policies, for example, on BRI or what's known as OBOR or One Belt, One Road, we do see change, right? So it's not that the CPC is incapable of changing its policy. It even changed the name. It used to be One Belt, One Road, now it's BRI. So, and this is Xi Jinping's #1 initiative, right, guys? So Here we have a situation where China's Communist Party is willing to change. But with regard to Taiwan, Hong Kong, and those issues closest to its core interests, where it says these are our Chinese people, 我们说了算. We are the ones who will determine. And so it's interesting that it's not necessarily a part of the party's nature, but it's related to these specific issues that the party has decided, in fact, perhaps even backed itself into a corner with its rhetoric, that it is recalcitrant. And so what we see is a kind of Procrustean bed where they're caught in a certain set of behaviors and almost unable to change. And so I'm reminded of one of my favorite stories by Edgar Allan Poe, The Purloined Letter. In this story, the prefect is only able to enhance his techniques or reduce them. But changing his techniques are beyond his capability, not because he's not smart, but just because he so honed himself and trained himself in those techniques. And so I see China right now as captured by its own rhetoric, captured by its own techniques, that there is nobody in the world who could stop China from altering its strategy if it so chose to do so. What's interesting is it chooses not to do so. And I agree with you that it won't. It's almost interesting that we keep asking, will it? But I suppose that this is something that I hope folks in Beijing are thinking about why we are able to be flexible on some things and not on others, especially when it seems that when they are flexible, they get positive progress, right? They open their ears to people on BRI, they get more progress on BRI. They close their ears to the people of Taiwan, and we can see the result. They close their ears to the people of Hong Kong, we see the result. So it's not as if they're deaf, but they're not responsive. And I think this is it's worth just putting a bit of nuance on this, that I don't think it's a unique part of the party. I think it's the uniqueness of these issues and how the party has highlighted these issues and said they're special.
Just on the point of BRI, though, I would just, Josh, and I'm sure you know this, but BRI it's actually still One Belt, One Road in Chinese, right? It's still
Of course,
一带一路.
一带一路, yeah.
Right? So it's sort of like, sort of old wine in new bottles, right? So it's not so much an adaptation or a change fundamentally. It's still the same sort of set of policies and motivations and purpose that drives BRI, I think, and you can disagree with me about that, but just the framing of it, the rhetoric of it, is does adapt and does sort of change to suit the purpose of I think the party's motivation.
I agree with Russell on this, and just to add a point of nuance here, it's definitely the same domestically, but the word BRI isn't meant domestically, as you know, right? It's meant for us. It's meant for foreigners. So what's interesting is why apparently how they treat foreigners, there is a change, even if, as you say correctly, there is no change in the Chinese version.
And I would agree with Josh's point. I mean, I think rhetorically, and in terms of the fundamental policy tenets, Beijing has backed themselves into a very tight corner. But I do think it remains to be seen whether they'd be willing to make adjustments to their actual policy approach to Taiwan, or whether they are just going to double down. I mean, we've seen some scholars argue that the election outcomes could actually reinforce in Beijing's mind that the only outcome for their interests is a military one, versus continuing to do what they're doing, which is chipping away at Taiwan's legitimacy, trying to undermine Tsai, and trying to find partners that they think they can work with in Taiwan as well. So I think there might be a little bit of adjustment around the margins, but I think you're right that the core policy cannot change. I mean, I think it risks so much political.
So one more quick point, which is if we look at Xi Jinping's speech from a year ago, right, a year ago after the KMT had done pretty well, we see basically this combination, this combining of the one country, two systems with the 92 consensus, which puts the KMT in a tough position vis-a-vis their particular position on that issue. But it also shows that perhaps, and I don't want to put myself too firmly in the shoes of Beijing, maybe they see this as a fluke, right? Maybe they see this as not worth changing the course, at least not yet. Because maybe they say what Russell said a minute ago, it's 33.3 versus 33.9. Maybe this is just more about her than it's about us. I don't know if they think that, but it seems in their Guangfang media that they do.
I mean, that's an interesting question, because the demographic trends and the opinion polls has consistently proven that to be a false assumption.
That's right. That's right.
I'd like to pivot a little bit to the U.S. Position and role in this. I remember back in late 2016 when Tsai was elected for the first time, and I was able to go to Taiwan and speak with her just a few days after the historic phone call between her and President-elect Trump. I remember at the time, Taiwanese people were very excited, and it seemed that there was a kind of a peak in U.S. support for Taiwan. So Sean, I'd like to ask you, how do you see U.S. support or the U.S. policy towards Taiwan under the Trump administration? Has it been just a continuation of previous administrations? Is it more supportive of Taiwan? What's your view on that?
Well, I think nothing the Trump administration does is a continuation of previous administrations. So, and during the campaign, I never foresaw Trump as being a Taiwan guy, especially when now he's saying Xi Jinping is his great friend. And then he wrote off taking Tsai's call by saying, well, I wasn't president, and then he reiterated the one China policy in February. But since about mid-2017, he's really surprised me, and I think we're in for whatever reason, we're in a mini golden age of U.S.-Taiwan relations. And my fear is that with people like Randy and John Bolton, true Taiwan believers leaving the administration, will that change? Was this something that Trump actually has in his mind, or did he just set the experts loose to do what they wanted to do as a way to kind of stoke China? And now that he's got his trade deal, even if it's not the greatest ever like he says, will he dial back the support of Taiwan? I don't know. I've been very heartened by the things. It's the Taiwan Travel Act by actually signing it, the F-16 sale, giving Tsai Ing-wen the red carpet treatment, treating her almost as a head of state when she's visited LA, Houston, and Denver. And also in the Pacific, when Tsai Ing-wen went to Palau in March, I noticed that Amy J. Hyatt, our ambassador there, was present at the dinner. And Mike Pompeo and others have been actually going around to countries encouraging them not to recognize Beijing. And I know Mike Pence canceled his meeting with the Solomon Islands in New York around the time of the UN in protest. And the Solomon Islands said, well, yeah, if we shouldn't de-recognize Taiwan, why don't you reestablish diplomatic relations with them? It was kind of a good point. So
Yeah.
I think but I'm, much to my surprise, very heartened by what I've seen from the Trump administration so far in Taiwan. I just hope it continues.
Yeah. Tiffany, how do you view Taiwan's security situation? Because it seems like, and their international situation, it seems like we have basically two kind of divergent trends here, or maybe even three. So on the one hand, very strong U.S. support. On the other hand, I believe the fewest, official Taiwanese diplomatic allies in Taiwan's history. How do you view the situation now?
I think that's a good question. I think on that point about the strong U.S. support, I think that's absolutely right. We are seeing a high point in U.S.-Taiwan relations. In addition to this support from the executive branch, I would also say, during the time of the Trump administration, we've seen very strong support from Congress, both in the Taiwan Travel Act, as John mentioned, in the NDAAs, and now this pending sort of Taipei Act that aims to support Taiwan's international space. So I do think there is a strengthened relationship between Taiwan and Washington, which is important, and as well as Taiwan's unofficial relationship with other like-minded democratic countries such as Japan, which I think has been a very significant step forward. So at the same time, I think the question here is, does that outweigh the loss of diplomatic allies as Beijing keeps pressuring Taiwan? And I would say, I think Taiwan gets very different benefits from the small diplomatic allies versus friends and partners such as Japan and the United States. So from Japan and the United States, we're seeing a lot of security and strategic benefits that perhaps that they don't find in some of the smaller diplomatic allies. So I don't have a perfect answer for you, but that's how I see those two trends sort of balancing each other.
Let me jump on. You mentioned Japan. Usually, at least in the United States, when we talk about Taiwan, we talk about three countries, China, Taiwan, and the U.S. But Japan is a player, actually. So I think, Sean, you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think Japan's really important in this. And, any defense of Taiwan would come from U.S. forces in Okinawa. And there's a lot of sympathy for the DPP in Taiwan in Japan. And obviously, a DPP government will be a lot friendlier to Japan on its core interest issues, things like the Senkaku Islands and also Okinatori. So, and, trying to understand Trump's positive disposition toward Taiwan, maybe it's because it's not an official ally because we don't have troops there. He can't complain that they're not paying enough. All he knows is that they buy a lot of weapons. So, we're complaining to Abe and Moon that they don't pay enough, And then he's in love with Kim, and Xi Jinping's this great guy, but Taiwan just keeps going along. And in terms of international space, I think China's helping create a lot of space for Taiwan unofficially by its own sharp elbows in other parts of the world. I mean, unlikely, Sweden now is involved in official environmental cooperation with Taiwan because of issues that Stockholm's having with Beijing. And then just one leftover comment from the legislative discussion. I know Beijing is trying to look for any good news, but I think they're grabbing at straws because sure, people may have voted equally for the KMT and DPP on the party list, but that's after they voted for their own DPP representative in their constituency. So somebody votes for Tsai, then they vote for their representative DPP, then maybe just to balance things out or feel better about themselves. I don't know why they vote KMT, but I mean, that's any party that brands itself as a Chinese nationalist party from abroad, you could say those people are dying out. I think the KMT is in trouble long term. And I never thought I'd see a day when the DPP controlled the legislature anyway. I thought that was just a reaction from the Sunflower Movement in 2016. So even if they still got 61 seats, a DPP legislature in the 60s, if that's the new normal, that's bad news for the KMT.
You mentioned the international space for Taiwan, and just so for anyone on the panel, and Randy mentioned as well, creative ways that the United States can maybe create new space for Taiwan to engage in the international community. What are some policies that the United States has pursued or could pursue, new ways to give Taiwan a greater space in the international community?
Sorry.
Josh, go ahead.
Yeah. Just a couple of quick ones on this. First, we shouldn't forget that the United States and President Nixon met with Mao Zedong under a situation where we didn't recognize each other. My point is there's a lot that can be done in engaging Taiwan under the current framework that hasn't been done. Why haven't we decided to do more? I think that has a lot more to do with us than it has to do with China or Taiwan. And so I do think that under the current framework as it exists right now, we could do more than what we've done to have a more robust relationship with Taiwan. I'm glad to hear we're in a golden age. I think it can get shinier, though. I don't think we are restricted by the current platforms to engage Taiwan more. And I also want to just mention one thing, just as a thought experiment, which I'm fond of doing. What if you got rid of all of Taiwan's allies? What if you, or the ROC's allies? We should speak clearly here. What if you got rid of all the ROC allies? What, except for threats from Beijing, would prevent Taiwan from declaring the Republic of Taiwan the next day? So there is, for Beijing, some risk in denuding Taiwan of every ally, because then what do you have left but your military might to keep them in check? And so I think that for China, they should think twice before they clear the field entirely. That may be a celebration at the foreign ministry in Beijing, but I think that the next day gives Taiwan actually more flexibility than it would if it has to keep the Solomon Islands and Swaziland and all these folks recognizing the fallacy of the ROC.
If I may just jump in quick, I qualified with the mini golden age, not we can always get shinier, like the golden dome.
We can shine it up. Yeah, the golden dome.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to reiterate something that was mentioned earlier, and just for the people in the audience, in case people are not familiar with it, but really the Global Cooperation and Training Framework is an exemplary model for how U.S.-Taiwan cooperation can be enhanced and expanded. And there are positive momentum in how that framework has evolved over the years, to now including not only the United States and Taiwan as coordination partners, but also including Japan, as a matter of fact. And one of the most recent workshops that was held under this framework was actually included not only Japan, but also Sweden. And this was focused on media literacy, AKA how to combat CCP disinformation, right? And that is one of a functional area of Taiwan's expertise and know-how that is now being leveraged under this cooperative framework to really not only benefit so that these countries that are also facing similar challenges and threats, but also helping enhance Taiwan's ability to interact with policymakers, government officials in those countries that would otherwise be intimidated by the PRC in having any type of engagement with Taiwan. And I would just applaud, again, the Department of State in sending the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Scott Bugsby to attend both of these forums in Taipei that were held. There were 2 forums that were held, both one last year and another year, another before that. And I think that this is, again, an exemplar model for how the United States and Taiwan can think creatively about issue areas that Taiwan excels in. There's been workshops that have been held in the past on women empowerment, on energy, digital economy. I mean, these are issues that the world is grappling with, and really, I think Taiwan's experience in these areas should be and can be better leveraged and for all to benefit.
Yeah. And I think Russ's last point there is really important because when we talk about international space for Taiwan, what we frequently focus on is Taiwan's participation at international organizations as well as its diplomatic ally space. And I think what Russ and Josh have suggested is sort of broadening that aperture to think about how do we integrate Taiwan into efforts by the United States and its allies and partners, but also, what lessons can Taiwan offer the region? I mean, I would argue that Taiwan can offer a lot of benefits to the region, especially to countries which are concerned about China's political influence. For example, I mean, Taiwan is sort of ground zero for China's political interference, at least in the lead up to this election. And we've seen the private sector and the government both take actions. And those are really important lessons for the United States and other countries who are confronting the same concerns.
Just one additional point. Just qualify one thing that Tiffany had mentioned, that it's not just in the lead up to this election that China has been interfering politically in Taiwan. It's been going on for decades. And I think the international community is only waking up to this because with China's rise, other countries are now experiencing the similar types of challenges that Taiwan has been experiencing for decades, and now people are looking at Taiwan and say, "Oh, wow, what can we learn from you?"
Exactly.
And to be able to still have, a relatively resilient society in the face of such overwhelming influence operations.
If I could Josh raises an important intellectual point, and that is, to deny the existence of the Republic of China also denies those people in Taiwan who want to identify as Chinese the right to do so. And it almost pushes Taiwan into a corner to build its own independent identity. And if they knock off enough diplomatic partners, that's exactly what might happen. 1974, the United States recognized East Germany because West Germany said that's fine. They weren't out to eviscerate East Germany. And now we see even South Korea opening up doors for North Korea because they were content and secure in the existence of a German or a Korean nation. And we have 2 Koreas in the United Nations. Maybe it's Beijing's own insecurity, the historical veracity of its claims on Taiwan. That's why it's so insecure. But by trying to say the ROC doesn't exist, it's almost like you're bringing forward the creation of an independent Taiwan.
Yeah. How do you have the 92 consensus if you don't have an ROC? I mean, I don't know. I'm asking that question almost to our panelists here. And what happens when Beijing says we want a 92 consensus, but nobody in the world recognizes this entity?
Well, after Xi Jinping's January 2nd, 2019 speech, I don't think there is a 92 consensus.
Well, to the KMT there is,
Right.
right? And so you leave the KMT of almost no ground to make their argument. And I think that is arguably not in the CPC's interests. But yeah.
I'm curious, do you see, because some critics perhaps of Tsai would say that she is the one who has changed the status quo. Other people would say, no, it's obviously China that has changed the status quo. Can it be both? I mean, looking at Xi's speech, I mean, first of all, if you can say specifically what you mean about him kind of, now there no longer being a 1992 consensus. And then also, we've seen President Tsai say, the Republic of China, Taiwan is already an independent country. What is going on here?
Well, I wish I knew.
Can I?
Yeah, of course, yeah, to Russell.
I mean, I put the blame squarely at Beijing's feet. It's worth remembering after the January election in 2016 that there were expectations that Beijing might send some conciliatory signals. That was dashed only just a couple months afterwards when Beijing decided to establish diplomatic ties with Gambia. It's worth remembering that Gambia is a country in Africa, but it broke ties with Taiwan in 2013. Beijing decided only to establish diplomatic ties with Gambia 2 months after Tsai's election, even before she was able to even give her inaugural speech outlining the policies of her administration. And after that, she had actually outlined her policy basing on 3 fundamental tenets, which is the ROC Constitution, the constitutional order, the act governing relations between the people of the mainland area and the Taiwan area, and as well as the historical facts of the 1992 meetings that were held. Yet, Beijing responded with that this was an incomplete test paper, right? Essentially saying that, no, you did not go far enough by agreeing to one country, two systems, which is essentially still the model by which Beijing insists on political unification with Taiwan. And as we all know, that's working out perfectly well in Hong Kong, right? So, which is, again, that's the model by which China now is engaging in its activities in Hong Kong. So, again, that's sort of my take on that, on your question, Bethany. But I'd welcome the other panelists and what they think.
Well, I think in military terms, Beijing's been altering the status quo, but so is the evolution of Taiwan's people in democracy. You know, Taiwan's not what it was in 1979. And I think Tsai's been very low-key, very pragmatic. She's managed Xi, but she's also managed Trump very well. And I think that counts for a lot in domestic eyes. And she's come a far way to the middle by embracing the ROC. And I saw that interview on BBC because I heard all these things, you know, I took that as very reassuring. It's almost she's signaling, I'm not going to declare formal independence. We have what we want. To me, that was a signal to Beijing, don't expect any provocative moves in my second term. So I took it just the opposite.
Interesting. We're going to switch to audience questions really soon. I just want to throw one more topic out there, and that is economic ties. This could go in several different ways. You know, for example, how does the trade deal, you know, between the U.S. and China, how's that going to affect Taiwan and, you know, economic ties? Or if you want to talk about China-Taiwan economic ties. So just opening this up to whoever would like to speak.
Bethany, can I make one quick comment on
Sure,
the previous
please.
topic?
Please do.
And then, because I don't want to interrupt. So I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Suu Kyi in 2006. Suu Kyi is this guy who has behind the 92 consensus, as people are nodding, you know. And I asked him, I said, what is the 92 consensus? I really wanted to hear his view. And this is what he said to me. He said, we walk into a room, the mainland side and us, we close our eyes and ears, and they say the 92 consensus is the PRC. And then they close their eyes and ears, and we say the 92 consensus is the ROC. And then we talk about fishing rights and all other matters. And this was how he described it to me, almost verbatim. And so the point I was trying to make before is, if you forego the opportunity for the KMT side to say that this is the ROC, then you have undermined that modus vivendi for communication and dialogue. And so it may not have been the intent of removing the diplomatic partners to do so, to weaken Taiwan internationally. But what you've done is made it functionally, I don't want to say impossible, but really hard for the KMT to sit across from you and have that conversation the same way they did in 2006, 2007. So I just wanted to put a bit more granularity on that. And it's also worth noting, just a point of history, my understanding is that Deng Xiaoping initiated one country, two systems for Taiwan. And then it was applied to Hong Kong. So we shouldn't be surprised that it will be applied to Taiwan, since that was its original intent. What's interesting is the way that that's happening and the evolution of it. Not that it happened, which is what, of course, Deng Xiaoping had originally intended. Thanks. Sorry to interlope.
That's a great point. And I love your historical sort of clarification there about one country, two systems.
Thanks.
Anyone have any quick thoughts on the U.S.-China trade deal? Yes.
I don't know what the U.S.-China trade deal is all about. I have to wait and see. Again, the idea that it's enforceable, again, the courts there are at the whim of the Chinese Communist Party. My fear is that if Trump gets something from China in time for the election, he may ease up on Taiwan in exchange. I'd like to see an FTA or whatever we want to call it, customs union or whatever, like New Zealand had with Taiwan. But again, there's bandwidth. You know, we wasted a lot of time making marginal changes to NAFTA and the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. Now we want to do one with the U.K. post-Brexit. Do we have the staff and the bandwidth to actually do an FTA? And also, I know Taiwan sometimes can't get out of its own way on FTA issues. And I know pork right away. That's the first thing that'll come up. So, you know, on ractopamine, things like that, is Taiwan willing to modernize its view on pork to get an FTA with the U.S.? I think there's potential, and I hope it moves forward.
Okay.
On your question about cross-strait trade, this is continuing going to be an important issue. This has been a card that's used by Beijing before. And with the ECFA agreement expiring in June of this year, I think there's a lot of questions on where the future of cross-strait trade will go, whether the tariffs will come back, whether there's going to be political pressures to renew, and what that negotiation mechanism could look like sort of in the absence of recent high-level political dialogue on two sides. But I will say, I think, it looks like there's also an emphasis on diversifying Taiwan's trade partners, which has been going on for several years now, as Sean mentioned, with New Zealand, for example. And Tsai herself has said a bilateral trade agreement with the United States was going to be one of the priorities. And I think this would be an important step for modernizing Taiwan's economy, improving market access. But I think most importantly, it's the strategic benefits. It serves as a potential model for Taiwan to then pursue similar agreements with other partners, Australia, EU, Japan, et cetera. So I think we do need to look at Taiwan's position in global trade and sort of, again, what does it have to offer for other countries in the world?
So, I saw some numbers that were really, I think, interesting on this particular topic, and that was where the U.S. trade deficit now is in Asia. And we can see that our trade deficit is now being distributed among a variety of different Asian countries, which are now exporting to us the goods that China, to some degree, had been before. That's in part because China is moving up the value chain, but it's also because folks were concerned about these particular issues and will be concerned going forward that they may rise their head. So what I think is good is to see a diversification of trade. And I'm looking at Pat here. We've been talking about this many years ago. But to diversify our trade portfolio so that we are not overly reliant on any one trade partner, particularly one that has the security complications that Randy stood here telling us all about. So I do think that this process that we've gone through, which hasn't been painless, but hasn't been nearly as painful as the Davos crowd would make you believe. Now, don't forget, they were standing there at these microphones with their millions of dollars telling us all the sky was going to fall if we confronted China on trade. But it didn't. The U.S. economy is as strong as it's ever been. We can defend ourselves and still have a robust economy. There is no need for us to be afraid of defending our interests. And I think that if I've learned anything from these past few months is that the Chicken Littles of this world are overblown. And they are usually doing it to feather their own nests because they have benefits. Then I don't think it's the American worker they're protecting. And so I look at them askance now. And I think that they have some defense of their position. I want to hear these ill effects. And look, I live in a farming state, and the people of Indiana would love to sell their pork to Taiwan and anyone else that'll buy it. But I think that we've sent a very clear message to China that we don't want to do business as we've done it in the past. Now, what does that mean for China and how it runs its economy? Unfortunately, I hate to disappoint, I don't think much, because everything in China is under the leadership of the Communist Party, so everything is political, including the economy, the SOEs. They're all branches of the Communist Party of China. So are we going to be able to leverage China to change its entire economic system? No, that won't happen. And if the folks in this country are saying that that was an actual objective of the policy, I think they misunderstand what this policy was truly intended to do. So I think that there's, you see folks for domestic political reasons, for their own personal reasons, making statements. And I would just caution all of us that what we've seen over the last couple of months or years is that we can have a robust defense and also expand our trade with more partners. And that those, like a river jumping its banks, the river never comes back exactly where it was. And so I think the fact that we see American companies moving back into Southeast Asia, meeting the old friends they used to have back in the days of the Tigers, I don't think that's going to change. I think that's a process that has begun and will continue. And that process is to the good of the United States.
I think that this is a great place to open it up for.
Sorry, a little bit.
No, that was a great kind of final note. So thank you for that, and I will now open up for questions from the audience. Yes, right here.
Hi, Lana Danielson with the U.S. Taiwan Business Council. Thank you so much for talking about the BTA or potential FTA. That's something that we will definitely be looking at going forward. I had one question. One of the sort of side effects of the U.S.-China trade confrontation has been that a lot of Taiwan companies are coming back home, repatriating to, or reshoring, I guess, to Taiwan. At the same time, we've seen quite a lot of new startups come in Taiwan. They've been really focused in the Tsai administration on building a startup environment in Taiwan. My question to you is, what do you see as the challenges for these companies coming back to Taiwan? Is there enough manpower? Is there enough personnel? Is there enough land, power, water, all those kinds of issues for Taiwan to really take advantage of these companies coming back home?
I don't really have specific views on, maybe I'll defer to someone else on whether or not Taiwan can handle it, but that was my next point had we not ended the main session there. Is one thing I'm going to keep an eye on. If U.S.-China tensions die down, are those Taiwan companies that came home going to go back to the mainland? So I'm going to be keeping a close eye on that. And as Randy mentioned, we have an election here this year. So would a second-term Trump stay as good on Taiwan? Or I hope the next president, whoever he or she may be, would be as good on Taiwan too. So there are a lot of variables. So I really don't have a view on whether or not Taiwan companies will find a way back home, how well they'll do. But I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye to see if they boomerang back now that U.S.-China tensions died. Does anybody have any view on Taiwan companies coming home?
Yeah, so on the point about returning investments, I think that's a really important trend we're seeing, and I think it's more than just patriotism. I think it makes economic sense in the same way that a lot of Western companies are finding economic sense in expanding investment in Taiwan, especially taking advantage of the push to high technology, AI, Asia Silicon Valley initiative by the Tsai administration. So I think all that's been encouraging. I think it's in part they're finding it harder to do business in Hong Kong or in China, but I think it's in part, there's some of the market dynamics in Taiwan that works for them. I think the other concern we have about multinational companies as an effect of the US-China trade war is, are they choosing to go at other places? It's not just Taiwan, which arguably has a higher manufacturing costs, but a lot of these companies are going to Southeast Asia as well. So I think Taiwan does benefit, and I think the administration has been smart to sort of focus on particular sectors. But again, I think with Sean, I think this is a space that we have to watch to see how much this will continue to grow, or whether there's a ceiling due to issues like labor, water, and things like that.
The only point I would add is that to talk of what Tiffany had just mentioned, we see a lot of Taiwanese moving to, I think Vietnam is a favored location. And so it's not just US manufacturers, as you point out, it's also going to be those Taiwan manufacturers that may be looking for options outside of China. So it may not just be Taiwan is my point. They may look for other low-cost producers.
But no matter who it is, South Korean, US, Taiwanese, another attraction to Taiwan is its free and open society, progress on a number of issues, and open politics compared to a place like Vietnam. So Taiwan's not just a draw versus the mainland, it's also a draw to some other more autocratic regimes in the region.
Rule of law.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm Pat Malloy. I was on the China Commission. Josh was one of our young staffers in the China Commission.
Not so young anymore, Pat.
You did a great job, Josh, and I agree with your points. Sean, I think we met over 21 years ago.
And you were at my sister's wedding.
I think we were trying to bring you into commerce when you had that illustrious career in the Commerce Department.
And I eventually was there, but after you had left.
Yeah.
So.
I read in the Washington Post today a terrific article by George Will on the Taiwan election. But he did say this, and I want to run it by here. He said that the United States had an obligation to defend Taiwan if it were attacked by force. My understanding is Carter abrogated the Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty in '79. Congress then passed the Taiwan Relations Act in 1980. And although we will sell Taiwan what it needs to defend itself, it says if Taiwan is attacked, we will decide what to do according to constitutional processes, which means that the Congress declares war in this country, and the Congress is regrouping, is trying to get that authority back from the president right now. So I wanted to ask, what do you think about, am I right in my analysis that we have no legal obligation to defend Taiwan? And what do you think the movement is in Congress if that became a requirement, that we got involved in helping Taiwan defend itself?
And maybe I can take the hardball the slurve. Look, to me, this is a political issue more than a legal one. And Pat, you're an attorney and I'm not. So I'm a political scientist and you're an attorney. So maybe you see it from a legal perspective, I see it from a political one. But to me, the question is the political will to defend Taiwan there, or is it not? And if it is, then the policy shall be thus. If it is not, then the policy will be the opposite. My understanding of the actual law, though, is that we have an obligation to help Taiwan to defend itself, right? To sell them such articles such that they can defend themselves. And I think the question for us here might be, what happens if we fail in our obligation? What if we don't sell them enough articles to actually defend themselves? And so the issues that Randy was talking about deterrence don't happen, right? We don't sell the arms, there is no deterrence, and therefore there is a conflict. Do we then have an ethical or a moral responsibility because we didn't adhere to the TRA to make sure we had sold enough to intervene? And I think that, again, is a political question. But I think we do have a legal responsibility to sell Taiwan those articles to defend itself. And again, our question is, what if we fail to sell them sufficient articles? Or that China then pushes back in a way that puts us in a very difficult political or geopolitical position, especially vis-a-vis Japan.
When you say it's a political question, is that in the administration or is that in the Congress?
Obviously, on this kind of issue, it's going to be both. I mean, I teach a course on global policy making, and we have discussions about the Congress's role. But the TRA is a congressional creature, right? It was created to push back on Carter because the Congress had felt that Carter had moved too fast with normalization. So because the TRA is created by the Congress, signed by Carter, but created by the Congress, I would see, and then I think in 2006 reaffirmed by the Congress, I think they're going to have a role to play.
I mean, the only point I would add to Josh's excellent response is that it's not only articles but services as well, you know, in the TRA. So it's not just defense articles, but it's also services provision to Taiwan. And the other provision is also to maintain the capacity to resist coercion as well, which is, I think, a broader language that includes a broader obligation on the United States, not so much expectations on Taiwan, but expectations on the United States to be able to be ready to respond to such use of coercion by China to affect the social system in Taiwan. So I think there's a broader component to just a defense of an invasion scenario.
As a longtime subscriber and faithful reader of the recently defunct Nelson Report, I would agree with your literal interpretation. There's not a legal trigger. And I think it would depend on the circumstances of any invasion. You know, if we had a Chen Shui-bian times 10 who brings it upon Taiwan that this happens, it may be a different story. But if it were totally unprovoked from the mainland, I think the US would lose a lot of credibility in its other relationships around the world if we didn't defend Taiwan. But I think that's going to be on a case-by-case basis depending on the circumstance. It would be largely political, as Josh says, but I don't see the legal trigger, so I concur with your reading of it.
Thank you.
I am Garrett Van der Wees. I teach Taiwan history at George Mason University. Thanks very much for an excellent panel. I wanted to come back to a point that Russell and Sean raised, and that's the party list. I think it's a bit deceptive to compare the Kuomintang party list with just the DPP party list. As Sean said, the people first vote for the president, then they vote for the districts, and then for the party list. And there they have expressed their opinions. If you compare just the party list for the Kuomintang with Han Kuo-yu's percentage, then that's 38 versus 33. So he lost a little bit, and that's probably went to Mayor Keough of Taipei. With Tsai Ing-wen, you see a much larger percentage for Tsai, 57% versus the 34%. And those people are generally people who wanted to assure that Tsai won, but at the same time, they are very much for checks and balances. So they voted for some of the other smaller parties, which are actually more progressive than the DPP, the New Power Party, and Taiwan Nation Building Party. So I think it's indeed essential to understand that difference between the two.
Thanks, Garrett. And I mean, and not to disagree with you here, but I would just say that, you know, I think, perhaps one of the surprising results from the election was also that the KMT did not win as much seats, right? I think had you asked observers only a few months before the election, I think many were expecting that the KMT was going to gain a majority of the KMT, possibly. But them only having gained 3 seats, increasing their number of seats from 35 to 38, that was perhaps an underperformance on their part. But that being said, the DPP still lost 7 seats, right? And while they were able to maintain a majority, that is a much weaker majority. And I think your point about the third parties is an important one, but they're not all necessarily progressives and liberals. That one of the major third-party forces now is the TPP, not to be mistaken with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but the Taiwan People's. Yes, that's right. But the Taiwan People's Party, which was established by Mayor Keough, the independent candidate from Taipei, and they are avowedly sort of partisan, so to speak, and has not taken on sort of a much more sort of liberal or progressive sort of position on these social issues. And so I do think that there is a very interesting sort of new legislative yuan now that I think we do sort of reflect some more complexity and nuances in terms of the results and what it may mean for public sentiment there in Taiwan.
Speaking of Keough, he's building some international space for at least Taipei this week in Prague.
Yeah.
So keep an eye on him.
I think you.
This is going to be our last question.
I'm sorry.
Can we maybe do 2 questions at once?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's like in your line of sight or not. So yeah.
Can we maybe take this question and then add hers
Thanks
onto it?
very much.
And
Bob
then do it at
Sutter
the same
from
time?
George Washington University. Really appreciate the panel. All this, I'm a big fan of the improvement of U.S. relations with Taiwan, but it's been a struggle, and what I'm concerned about now, though, is a bit counterintuitive, and it's in this mini golden age, as Sean talked about, and in this age of adjusting frameworks, as Josh talked about, are there limits? In other words, how far do we go? From the PRC perspective, we're slicing salami. You see, we keep slicing salami. And are we going to continue along these lines? And so this is, against the background of, we never seem to talk about the one China policy anymore. We don't say that. We just keep going ahead with Taiwan, but we don't say it's within the context of the one China policy. And maybe that's just an oversight, but I don't think so. And so I'm just raising this issue. I mean, what would the panel recommend? How far should we go with Taiwan?
We'll add this question from this one right here, and then we'll give it to the panel.
I can make my question tie into that. That's a very good one. To me, the elephant in the room when we talk about Taiwan from an inside China perspective is, if there is such a decidedness in Taiwan to be independent in some way or another, then why are there 1 million, maybe it's now 1 million minus 50,000, but 1 million Taiwanese living in China? And why has Taiwan put $150 billion plus FDI, which is more than 50% of its foreign direct investment, into China since the early 90s? This is a question which, of course, CCP officials bring up, and they get a bemused look on their face and say, if there is this problem, if they really don't love us, then why are they here? And Tiffany, you made the comparison with Taiwanese companies going back to Taiwan as potentially an issue of patriotism. Well, that's exactly what CCP officials will say. Was it unpatriotic for them to leave Taiwan, or was it patriotic to the one China principle? So I'd love your take on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie.
Wow. Do you want to start? And we can, maybe this will be our last, so we can each have a...
Well, one China principles, not one China policy. Taiwan didn't invest in the mainland. Taiwanese companies, free to make their own choices, did. And I would look at all the Canadians living in California and all the Canadians who own real estate in the U.S. and work there, they don't want to be American one bit. So economic integration, I don't think has anything to do with national identity. We can push, I don't want to push so far that we imperil Taiwan. And I guess China's red line would be formal recognition, but I think we're long overdue for a conversation about what the One China policy is, because too often Beijing willingly confuses it with its own One China principle.
Yeah.
And at the time, we had the Taipei government unelected by its own people and Beijing competing to be China. After constitutional reform in 1991, Taipei relinquished its claims to the mainland's terra firma. There no longer needs to be an either or. Just like we had two Germanys, we had two Koreas, we can at least have a conversation. If you believe in one Chinese nation, can't you accept there are two governments awaiting unification, if that's the way you feel? I think we need to have an honest interagency strategic policy review of how the One China policy happened and whether or not it's still relevant to today's world. Why can Donald Trump meet Kim Jong-un, who murders an American college student 3 times, say he's in love, but we have to pretend like Taiwan doesn't exist? I think these are just honest rhetorical questions that we have to ask ourselves, and it's well past high time for that.
Bob, I would just, I think, responding to Bob's question is that I think if you look at Vice President Mike Pence's speech that he gave at the Wilson Center, he did mention the One China policy. Personally, I prefer it when the administration refers to our One China policy, making a more clear distinction from that of what may be confused with One China principle or other countries' One China policy, because there are, as you clearly know from your many studies on this subject matter, that there are a lot of elasticity in terms of the meaning of One China policy and how it's executed in different administration. But I would just point that it's not completely lost in the discourse on China policy. But I think there has been in my view, a more conscious effort to distinguish between what is Beijing's concerted effort to obfuscate what One China means to what we can and cannot do with Taiwan under this administration.
Thank you, Russell.
Just starting with a question about the Taiwanese investment in China. I mean, it's become a very politicized issue, as you know. I mean, there's a lot of pressures on the Taishan, Taiwanese business people living in the mainland, and sort of incentivizing them to vote particular ways in the Taiwanese election. So I think that is absolutely a concern and it's a challenge, and especially in a democratic and open economic system, they have a lot of freedom to maneuver. On Bob's question about U.S.-Taiwan relations, I mean, I would argue under this administration, it's not necessarily that we see a more coherent application of a policy approach, but I do think what's significant in the current administration is that they seem to be less beholden to how China might respond, and they seem to care a lot less about what China says. And I think that gives a lot of freedom. I agree with Sean. I think it is time that we sort of reassess whether the United States One China policy works in U.S. interests. But I do think that's a very long-term conversation. I don't think there's short-term appetite to revamp America's cross-strait policy right now. But I will say in the interim, I think there's a lot of room under the current One China policy to improve relations, and that it's less restrictive, I think, at least in its language boundaries than the way that we've actually applied and executed ourselves. I will say, I think the real limit to U.S.-Taiwan cooperation, I think it's going to be the bandwidth of this administration. And we saw this in the George Bush administration, where there was a lot of focus on China and Asia, and then the attention got diverted to the Middle East, and we're kind of in a point where that might happen again.
Yeah. Ooh, let's hope that's not prophetic, right?
Nothing I've ever said has come true.
So starting with this question, then going to Bob's question here. So I had a really interesting experience on a train ride. I take trains in China. I urge you all to do so. Do not fly in China. One, it's a more expensive, and two, you don't get nearly as many interesting people. So I'm sitting on the train from Nanjing to Shanghai, and we stop in Suzhou, and the seat next to me is filled by a young gentleman, and we start talking. Turns out he's from Taiwan. He's at the Suzhou Technology Park. He's been lured there for these incentives that have been put out there. So I asked him the very same question. I said, well, what brought you to China, right? You know, as us foreigners often do when we meet somebody in China. And he said, well, the incentives. You know, I couldn't start my business in Taiwan. I just didn't have the wherewithal to do it. They gave me a chance to start, and I would have had nothing, or I got something, and so I had to take that. And then when I was in Suzhou, I met this nice girl, yada, yada, yada. Right. So you can see how, but pushed a little further, yeah, I miss Taiwan. Yeah, I miss my family. Yeah, I miss my freedoms. Yeah, sometimes, you know, working with mainlanders can be constrictive and difficult. So I think that it's not so clear that everybody who goes there says, as you know, CPC officials would want them to say, I'm there because I'm a nationalist of China, or that they're there necessarily because they had a choice. I think in this person's case, he was pretty clear that this was his only real viable option after getting out of school to start the company he wanted to start. And he took the chance that was before him. And I think we're all pragmatic to some degree in that way, and that's a very human story. And each one of these million people, I'm sure, has their own very human reasons why they made the decisions they did. Talking to Bob's question, which not surprisingly is one of, if not the best one of the day, no offense to anybody else. Look, my understanding of the One China policy is that the United States acknowledges that China believes that Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait believe that Taiwan is a part of China. What if we move to a position where we have so few people in Taiwan who say, I'm Chinese, right? What if they opt out of their own Chineseness, if they had it, right? And they say, I'm not Chinese, such that we end up in a point where we have a very, very few amount of people who say, I'm Chinese. Well, then the policy itself has eclipsed. Right? We end up in a position where there's nobody saying I'm Chinese, and that means that Chinese on both sides, well, what Chinese? We might as well be saying French on both sides, because there ain't no French neither. So I think that as Taiwan evolves, and as the people of Taiwan evolve in their conceptions of who they are, our policy is going to evolve apace. And it may at some point become an irrelevancy because there's nobody who says I'm Chinese. Now, the mainlanders may say, it doesn't matter what you think you are, I say you're Chinese. At that point, though, we're talking beyond your question to some degree, right? But, you know, how many, I don't know the numbers. I think somebody up here does. What percentage of people in Taiwan say, when asked, I'm Chinese? That's a really important question.
Probably 3%.
10 or fewer.
Less than that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're out of time. I'm going to bring things to a close. In just a few seconds, I'm going to ask you to thank our moderator and our panelists. I just wanted to point out my colleague, Maura Policelli, over there, who's the director in charge of this wonderful space and this wonderful office. If you're interested in finding out what else happens in this space, or if you and your organization are interested in using this space or partnering in using this space, please talk to Maura. She's here. But for now, please join me in thanking our wonderful moderator and our wonderful panel.